Hi there, I'm Mrs F, and this is my video on opposition, resistance and conformity. Although I'm following the Edexcel specification, a lot of the content is also relevant to other exam boards. So, this is the final part of topic 3, Nazi control and dictatorship. And in this lesson, I'm looking at the extent of support for the Nazi regime, and focusing in particular on opposition from the young. In my final lesson on key topic 3, we'll have a look at Nazi policies towards the churches and the opposition which they received in turn. There was undoubtedly a high level of support for the Nazis. In July 1932, the Nazis had won 230 seats in the Reichstag. This dipped slightly to 196 in November of the same year, but increased to 288 seats by March 1933, making them the largest party in the Reichstag. But although they were the largest party in the Reichstag, the Nazis never actually won an outright majority in any election. And after March 1933, there were no more elections, because the Nazis banned all other political parties. At the same time, there was a high level of conformity, which means acceptance of the Nazis. So even if people weren't wildly enthusiastic, they were kind of willing to go along with the flow. And there were two main reasons for that. First of all, there was censorship and propaganda. Goebbels, as we learnt last lesson, banned criticism of the Nazis and used the media to spread positive messages about them. And another reason for high levels of conformity was that the Nazis had a good deal of economic and foreign policy success. So as we'll see in a later lesson, Hitler massively reduced unemployment. And also within foreign policy, he helped to restore national pride by breaking the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, for example by rearmament, remilitarizing the Rhineland, and invading Austria and Czechoslovakia to bring more German-speaking people under Germany's control. There was, however, some resistance and opposition to the Nazis. Resistance means refusing to support something or speaking out against it. And there was a lot more resistance than there was opposition. It included very small acts, things like grumbling about the Nazis in private, not joining the Nazi party, reading banned books or listening to forbidden music, or maybe not using the Heil Hitler salute. Opposition, which means actively working against something to remove it, this was a lot rarer. But it's actually quite difficult to know exactly how much opposition there was, because firstly, any organised opposition, like trade unions or political parties, were banned, and of course, lots of leaders of those political parties had been sent to concentration camps. And if you did want to do it on an unofficial and secret level, then that was really risky. And we've already studied the Nazi police state with the Gestapo willing to arrest people and torture them to gain confessions. And I think that if we look at the power of the Nazi police state, perhaps what's remarkable is that there was any resistance and opposition at all. But in fact there was, and we're going to look at some of those different forms now. Even though official political opposition was banned, there was still some political opposition to the Nazis. So the banned Communist Party, for example, encouraged workers, and particularly former trade union members, to oppose the Nazis, quite often by undermining Nazi building projects. This might be by staying off work sick when you're not really ill, or deliberately damaging machinery to slow things down. And the SPD also continued to show their opposition. They printed a newspaper called the Red Shock Troop, with a circulation of 3,000 copies. When the organisers were arrested and sent to concentration camps, they set up the SPD abroad to campaign against the Nazis from where it was safer to do so. There was also opposition to Hitler from within the army, and actually amongst some really quite senior and high-ranking leaders, probably the most famous of whom is General Ludwig Beck, who was actually the chief of staff of the German army, so very high up. And in 1938, he tried to get his fellow officers to arrest Hitler, even sending a message to the British saying that the German army wouldn't fight if Britain attacked Germany, so very high treason indeed. And after the outbreak of World War II, opposition from the army increased, particularly as the tide started to turn against Germany. Beck led plots to kill Hitler in both 1943 and 1944. One of those plots, Operation Valkyrie, was made into a film which you can watch with Tom Cruise. Because Hitler tried to control religion in Germany, for example by closing religious schools and other measures, lots of religious leaders opposed the Nazis, both openly and in secret, but of course we're going to look at that next time. There were also a lot of young people who were opposed to the Nazi youth groups, particularly because they eventually became compulsory. And of course, most teenagers don't like the idea of being forced into things. Well, I think at any age we resent that. And they also opposed Nazi social policies. As we've learned, all kind of aspects of society and culture were Nazified, which meant that there was very little freedom of choice. And as a result, alternative youth groups began to grow up in defiance of the official Nazi groups, and particularly amongst the kind of more rebellious teenagers. And we're going to have a look at two of the best known youth opposition groups, the Swing Youth and the Edelweiss Pirates. The Swing Youth and the Jazz Youth were mainly teenagers from wealthy middle-class families in the large cities like Berlin and Hamburg. They admired American culture, like American clothes, film and music. And because they were from wealthier families, it meant that they could afford record players and play records which had been illegally imported from America. They liked to gather together, to drink alcohol, to smoke, to listen and dance in groups. And their favourite dance was the jitterbug. Gradually, they began to organise illegal dances, attended by up to 6,000 young people. I suppose they were kind of like the illegal raves of their day. Some youngsters preferred a different type of American music, jazz, which was made popular by black singers and musicians like Louis Armstrong. And as we've already learnt, the Nazis disapproved of jazz music, seeing it as kind of inferior and degenerate. Heinrich Himmler, leader of the SS, said that young people who listened to jazz music should be beaten, given the severest exercise and put to hard labour. The main working class youth group which opposed Hitler was the Edelweiss Pirates, which emerged in the working class districts of big German cities. And they used the symbol of the white Edelweiss flower to show their allegiance to their group. The group consisted of teenagers, both boys and girls, but mainly boys, who resented the military discipline of the Nazi youth groups and just the general lack of freedom in Nazi Germany. And stressing their own freedom to choose, they tended to wear their hair longer and copied styles of clothing that they saw in America, like white or checked shirts and white socks. In cities, they hung around on street corners, and it made it quite difficult for the Gestapo to distinguish them from other young people. If they came across members of the Hitler Youth, they would take the mickey out of them. Sometimes they would even attack them. And to break away from adults and Nazi restrictions, their favourite thing was to go on long hikes in the countryside, where they pitched tents, sang parodies of Hitler Youth songs, and told jokes which mocked the Nazis. Overall, I think that we can argue that youth opposition was fairly limited. First of all, their actions were limited. Apart from resisting Nazi expectations and maybe telling anti-Nazi jokes or doing anti-Nazi graffiti, they didn't really do much to oppose the Nazis. It was only after 1939, which is beyond the Edexcel syllabus, that their opposition actually became both more political and more violent. So, for example, they started distributing anti-Nazi leaflets. And in 1944, the pirates in Cologne actually killed the local Gestapo chief. And so the Nazis publicly hanged 12 members, as you can see in that photograph. We can also say that their motives were generally quite limited. Their opposition was mainly cultural, so looking at clothes, music and behaviour rather than political, until, of course, after 1939. And also their numbers were very limited compared to the Hitler Youth. So by 1939, there were about 2,000 Edelweiss Pirates, but membership of the Hitler Youth, being compulsory, was about 8 million. So the existence of these alternative youth groups shows that there were some German youth who were unconvinced by the Nazis and wanted to defy them. But really, they're not causing the Nazis any major headaches. They don't really pose any real threat to the Nazis. So now that we've had a look at how much support there was and opposition from young people, next lesson we're going to focus specifically on religion, how the Nazis tried to control it and how the churches began to oppose them. So I'll hopefully catch you next week for that lesson on religion. Thanks and goodbye.